The letter was still folded in Della Callahan's apron pocket, its wax seal unbroken, when the thunder of hooves reached her front porch. She had not read it. She had not even looked at it closely, because Hank Prout, the weathered foreman from the Double M Ranch, had ridden up to her door not 20 minutes ago with the kind of expression that men wear when they have been handed a task they do not entirely understand. He had pressed the envelope into her flour-dusted hands, touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, and said, "Mr. Maddox sends his regards, Miss Callahan. He asked me to deliver that personal." Then he had turned his horse and started back down the long, dusty road toward the ridge. Della had stood in the doorway watching him go, turning the envelope over in her hands, feeling the strange weight of it, the way a letter from Calvin Maddox always felt heavier than paper ought to. She had stepped back inside, set the envelope on the kitchen table beside the cooling coffee pot, and told herself she would read it after she finished straining the morning milk. She never got the chance. Because now the second set of hooves was louder, closer, and unmistakably urgent, and when Della pressed herself against the doorframe and looked down the road, her heart lodged itself somewhere behind her back teeth. Calvin Maddox was riding like the land itself was on fire. His black horse, a 17-hand animal the color of a storm cloud, was eating up the distance between his ranch and her small farm at a pace that said this was not a social call. His hat was pushed back, his dark coat open to the wind, and his jaw was set in that way she had only seen twice before, both times when something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. She pressed her hand flat against the letter in her apron pocket. He had sent Hank. He had sent his foreman to deliver the message, and then he had ridden over himself before it was even read. That meant whatever was in this envelope was not enough. It meant he had written something, folded it, sealed it, handed it to Hank, watched Hank ride away, and then decided, in whatever the space of a few minutes was, that ink and paper were wholly inadequate for what he needed to say. Della's mouth went dry. She stepped off the porch and walked 3 paces into the yard, her boots finding the dry Colorado earth, and she stood there, hands clasped in front of her, as Calvin Maddox reined his horse in with a force that sent a small cloud of red dust rolling toward her feet. He was off the animal before it had fully stilled, landing in the dirt with the controlled ease of a man who had spent more years on horseback than off, and then he was walking toward her, and his eyes, those dark, storm-colored eyes that had haunted her better judgment for going on 2 years, were fixed on her face with an intensity that made the whole August morning feel thin. "You haven't read it," he said. It was not a question. "I just received it," she said. "Hank wasn't gone 20 minutes. Calvin stopped 3 feet away from her. He pulled off his hat and held it in both hands in front of him, and the gesture was so uncharacteristically humble that it knocked the breath right out of her chest. Calvin Maddox was not a humble man. He was a good man, a fair man, a man who had dragged a failing cattle operation up out of the dust and turned it into the finest ranch in Garfield County by sheer force of will and ruthless competence. But humble was not a word she had ever associated with him. "Then I need to say it myself," he said. "Because I wrote it and then I read it back, and Della, it wasn't enough. The words on the paper weren't enough, and I couldn't let Hank ride down here with something that wasn't enough." The wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the creek behind her house. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the pasture. The whole world felt suspended, held in the specific kind of stillness that precedes either a great relief or a great catastrophe. "Calvin," she said carefully, "what is in that letter?" He looked at her for a long, searching moment, and then he said, "Everything I should have said 14 months ago." To understand what 14 months meant, and why the specific number of those months carried the weight it did, you had to go back to the autumn of 1882, to a Tuesday morning that smelled like coming snow and burned coffee, the day Della Callahan first set eyes on Calvin Maddox and made the profound tactical error of deciding he was nothing but trouble. She had arrived in Rifle, Colorado in September of that year, 26 years old, and carrying a grief so fresh it still bled at the edges. Her brother, Patrick Callahan, had written to her from the territory for 3 years running, describing a piece of land along Divide Creek that he was homesteading, land that was hard but honest, a place where a person could build something real. When Patrick died of a fever in June of 1882, he had left the deed to that land to Della, because she was the only family he had and because, as the lawyer in Rifle explained to her with the careful delicacy of a man delivering a second blow, Patrick had known the land would need someone stubborn enough to keep it. The lawyer's name was Edmund Hale, and he was a thin, careful man who wore spectacles and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and he had explained to Della, on that Tuesday morning in his office on Railroad Avenue, that there was a complication. The complication was named Calvin Maddox. "Mr. Maddox," Edmund Hale had said, steepling his fingers, "has been grazing cattle on the creek sections of your brother's land since this spring. He has a verbal agreement he claims your brother made with him, though I will tell you plainly, Miss Callahan, that I never drew up any such papers, and a verbal agreement on land use in Colorado territory carries exactly as much weight as the paper it is not written on." Della had sat across from Edmund Hale in a straight-backed chair, her traveling dress still dusty from the stagecoach, her dark hair pinned up with more determination than elegance, and she had felt the particular anger that comes not just from an injustice, but from an injustice arriving on top of exhaustion and grief. "And where is Mr. Maddox now?" she had asked. "As it happens," Edmund Hale had said, with the faint wince of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen, "he is in the outer room." Della had turned in her chair. Calvin Maddox had been standing in the doorway, having apparently let himself in from the street, hat in hand, with the calm, unhurried bearing of a man who was accustomed to walking into rooms and rearranging them by his presence. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with a face that had been weathered to a kind of rough refinement by sun and outdoor work. He was not handsome in any conventional, soft way. He was handsome the way certain landscapes are handsome, full of contour and shadow and the kind of specific beauty that requires you to look twice before you understand it. "Miss Callahan," he had said, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your brother was a good man." "He was," Della had said, standing up from her chair because she was not the kind of woman who received difficult conversations from a seated position. "And he left me his land, Mr. Maddox, all of it. Which means those cattle of yours need to find somewhere else to graze." Something had moved across Calvin Maddox's face then. Not anger, not exactly. Something more complicated, the expression of a man recalibrating a situation he had already anticipated but had hoped would go differently. "I'd like to talk to you about that," he had said. "I imagine you would," Della had replied. That conversation had lasted 3 hours, moved from Edmund Hale's office to the hotel dining room across the street, and had resulted not in a resolution, but in the beginning of a very specific kind of ongoing conflict that, over the months that followed, had gradually, dangerously, begun to resemble something else entirely. The facts of the dispute were these. Patrick Callahan, being a generous and informal man, had told Calvin Maddox in the spring of 1882 that the Double M cattle were welcome to use the creek sections of his land for summer grazing in exchange for Calvin's help building a new barn. Calvin had provided the help. The barn had been built. Patrick had died before anything formal was arranged, and now Della owned the land and had a barn she had not asked for, and a complicated, ongoing obligation she did not know what to do with. She had decided to work the land herself. This decision, she would reflect later, had probably been the single most significant act of pure stubbornness in her 26 years of life, which was saying something considerable, because stubbornness had been something of a Callahan family tradition. The homestead was a solid quarter-section along Divide Creek, with a 2-room cabin that Patrick had built with his own hands, a kitchen garden that had gone partially wild, a small orchard of young apple trees that were just beginning to produce. And that new barn, which was honestly the finest structure on the property and somewhat embarrassing to look at given the circumstances of its construction. The land would support a small operation, a milk cow, chickens, a kitchen garden expanded, and eventually, if the creek section was managed right, some hay production that she might sell to supplement her income. What it would not support was the grazing of Calvin Maddox's cattle, because she needed every blade of grass along that creek for her cow and for the hay she was planning to cut in the fall. She had told him this very clearly in October of 1882 in the yard of her homestead, while he sat on his horse looking at her with that particular expression she was learning to recognize, the one that said he was listening more carefully than he appeared to be. "I understand," he had said. "Good," she had said. "I'll move the cattle to the north pasture on the Double M," he had said. "But I want you to know that if you need anything, Miss Callahan, you only have to send word." She had not thought much of this offer at the time, because it sounded like exactly the kind of thing men said to women homesteading alone and did not mean, a social courtesy disguised as genuine assistance. She had been wrong about that as it turned out. The first winter in Rifle was harder than anything Della had experienced growing up in Ohio. The cold was different out here, drier and sharper, and it came with a wind that found every gap in the cabin walls and made the nights sound like something alive was trying to get in. She had plugged the gaps with rags and old newspaper and kept the wood stove burning through the nights, and she had managed, but only barely, and with the specific kind of managing that costs a person something they do not get back. In January of 1883, a blizzard hit the valley that lasted 4 days and left drifts against the north wall of her cabin up to the roof line. She lost 2 of her 6 hens to the cold, and her water barrel froze solid despite the stove. And on the morning of the 3rd day, when she woke to find the cabin temperature had dropped to somewhere below what she could measure on her small thermometer, she had allowed herself precisely 5 minutes of sitting at the kitchen table with her face in her hands before she straightened up and went back to work. On the afternoon of the 4th day, when the blizzard had finally relented to a steady, exhausted snowfall, she heard horses in the yard. Calvin Maddox had arrived with 2 of his ranch hands and a wagon loaded with firewood, a side of smoked pork, flour, dried beans, and a cast-iron Dutch oven that he set on her kitchen table without ceremony. "I figured the blizzard might have gotten into your stores," he had said, with his hat in his hands again, which she was beginning to understand was his natural posture when he was uncertain how a woman was going to receive him. "How did you know?" she had asked. "I sent Hank over to check on you on day 2, he had said. "He said the snow was drifted against your door, which meant you hadn't been out that day, which meant you were running low on wood and probably worried about it." She had looked at him for a long moment, this man who had sent his foreman to check on her well-being during a blizzard and then apparently spent the next 2 days loading a wagon. "Thank you," she had said, because she was not too proud to mean it. "Don't mention it," he had said, and he had looked away, out the cabin window at the white and silent landscape, and she had seen something in his profile then, a kind of careful restraint, that had made her start revising her original assessment of him in ways that made her quietly uncomfortable. He had not lingered. He and his hands had stacked the firewood in the lean-to at the back of the cabin, and then he had tipped his hat and ridden away, and Della had stood at her kitchen window watching the wagon disappear up the snow-covered road, and she had pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and tried to name the feeling that was pressing against the inside of her chest. She had not been able to name it then. She would come to know it very well later. The spring of 1883 brought a cattle fever to the valley that hit the smaller operations hardest, and Della's single milk cow, a gentle roan she had named Agnes, came down with it in April. The Garfield County livestock agent was a man named Wilson Prout, no relation to Hank, who was technically competent but chronically absent, And by the time Della managed to get word to him, and he managed to come out to her place, 3 days had passed and Agnes was in a bad way. It was Calvin who had appeared on the second day, summoned by nobody, apparently simply because he had heard from someone in town that there was a sick cow at the Callahan place. He had looked Agnes over with the practiced eye of a man who had been dealing with cattle medicine for more than a decade, had ridden back to the Double M, and returned that same evening with medicine and a set of instructions delivered with the matter-of-fact calm of someone sharing a recipe. Agnes had survived. Della had been grateful, and she had also been, for the first time, genuinely unsettled, because gratitude toward Calvin Maddox was beginning to feel complicated in ways she had not budgeted for. "Why do you keep doing this?" she had asked him, on the evening he came back to check on Agnes and found her still on her feet and eating, which they had both watched from the fence with a relief that felt disproportionate to the occasion. "You don't owe me anything. If anything, I was the one who sent your cattle off my land." He had been quiet for a moment, looking out over the pasture in the long, amber light of an April evening. "Your brother was good to a lot of people in this valley," he had said finally, "including me. I figure that's reason enough." She had accepted this answer at the time, even though some part of her, the careful, precise, grief-drained part of her that had learned to read what people did not say, understood that it was not the complete answer. It was the answer he was comfortable giving, and there was another one underneath it that he had decided to leave where it was. She left it there too, for a while. Through the summer of 1883, a pattern established itself that Della later recognized as the architecture of something inevitable. Calvin Maddox found reasons to ride past her place that were plausible but not entirely convincing. He fixed a fence section on her eastern boundary that was technically on his property line and could have been argued to be his responsibility. But he did it on a Tuesday morning when she happened to be in the kitchen garden within clear sightline, and he did not appear to be in any particular hurry. She brought him a cup of coffee because it was hot and he had been working for 2 hours, and they stood on opposite sides of the fence and talked about the weather and the price of hay and eventually, somehow, about Ohio, which it turned out he had passed through as a young man when he was making his way west. "What brought you to Colorado?" she had asked. "The mountains," he had said. "And the specific feeling of being a long way from where I started." She had understood that feeling completely, which had surprised her into telling him so, and then they had talked for another hour, and the coffee had gone cold in both their cups, and neither of them had mentioned it. Her neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Bauer who ran a small sheep operation half a mile up the road, noticed the pattern before Della was willing to name it herself. "That Maddox man has ridden past your gate 4 times in the past 2 weeks, Mrs. Bauer observed one afternoon in August, over the fence between their properties, with the serene certainty of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize what she was looking at. "Each time slower than the last. He has business on this road," Della had said. "His ranch is the other direction," Mrs. Bauer had said pleasantly, and gone back to her sheep. The specific evening everything shifted from its careful equilibrium was a Saturday in September of 1883, almost exactly a year after Della had arrived in Rifle. She had been invited to a harvest supper at the Garfield County Community Hall, which was a large, wood-framed building on the edge of town that served as a church on Sundays and everything else on every other day of the week. She had gone alone, which she was accustomed to, in a green dress that she had brought from Ohio and had not worn since Patrick's funeral, which meant she had to remind herself that the dress had nothing to do with funerals and everything to do with the fact that it was the nicest thing she owned. Calvin Maddox had been there. He had been there with a group of other ranchers from the valley, and he had been, she noticed with a precision she was trying not to feel, alone as well. He had asked her to dance once. Formally, correctly, with his hat off and his eyes meeting hers directly in the way she had come to understand was simply how he did things, without deflection or performance. She had said yes, which she had told herself was simply a social courtesy, and not in any way connected to the fact that she had found herself looking for him when she first walked in. He danced well, which was not something she had expected, with a steadiness that matched everything else about him. They did not talk much during the dance, because the music was lively and the hall was loud. But at the end of it, he held her hand for a moment longer than necessary before letting it go, and he looked at her with an expression she could not catalog, something that lived in the space between saying something and deciding not to. She had lain awake that night listening to the creak and been honest with herself for the first time about what was happening, which was that she was in a significant amount of trouble. She was falling in love with Calvin Maddox. This was a problem for several reasons, the clearest being that love was not something she had budgeted for when she had come to Colorado to run a homestead and grieve her brother and build something solid out of the wreckage of the last 2 years. Love was disruptive and unreliable, and had, in her limited previous experience with its early symptoms, a tendency to make her judgment unreliable. The second problem was that Calvin Maddox had given her no clear indication that whatever he felt was the same thing she was feeling. He was attentive and kind, and appeared in her life at reliable intervals, but he was also careful, and she was not certain whether that carefulness was because he was navigating feelings he was uncertain about or because he was simply a thorough and methodical man who applied the same careful attention to everything in his life, including neighbor women who had taken his cattle grazing land. She decided the safest course of action was to be practical. She would focus on the homestead. She would be friendly but not encouraging. She would not allow herself to be the kind of woman who stood at her window watching a man ride away and pressing her hand against the glass. She did not entirely succeed at this plan. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was milder than the previous one, which meant there were fewer emergencies and therefore fewer reasons for Calvin to appear at her door, which meant she felt his absence in ways that confirmed everything she had been trying to avoid feeling. She found herself listening for horses. She found herself, on the days she went to town for supplies, looking for the tall black horse at the hitching posts along Railroad Avenue. She found herself having imaginary conversations with him in the evenings while she mended clothes by the lamplight, and she was unsettled enough by this to decide something had to change. What changed it was a man named Gerald Aldridge. Gerald Aldridge was a land speculator who had arrived in Garfield County in February of 1884 with a suit that cost more than Della's cow and a smile that she distrusted immediately. He was looking to purchase creekfront land along Divide Creek, and he had made inquiries about several properties, including hers. He had come to see her on a Thursday afternoon very correctly through Edmund Hale, and he had offered her a price for her homestead that was, she acknowledged privately, a generous one. She had declined. He had come back 2 weeks later with a higher offer. She had declined again. On his third visit, in March, he had dropped some of the cordiality and suggested, in the careful language of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through means other than simple offers, that Divide Creek land was going to become less valuable before it became more valuable, and that she might want to consider the financial wisdom of accepting while his offer stood. Della had asked him to leave her property. He had gone, but the visit had left a residue of unease that she could not entirely shake, because the implication in what he had said was specific, and it had to do with water rights. Land along Divide Creek was valuable primarily because of the water. If someone were to file a claim on the water rights, or challenge existing ones, the agricultural value of the creekfront properties could be significantly affected. She did not know enough about Colorado water law to know exactly how serious the threat was, but she knew enough to know she needed to find out. She had gone to Edmund Hale, who had looked very serious and had said, yes. The situation with water rights in the valley was complicated, and there had been several challenges filed in the past 2 years, and she would be wise to have her deed and any associated rights properly recorded and documented. She had been walking out of Edmund Hale's office when she had run directly into Calvin Maddox, who was apparently walking in. They had both stepped back from the collision and looked at each other, and something in his expression when he saw her, a quickening she could not misread, had undone about 3 months of her very careful practical plan. "Miss Callahan," he had said, "are you all right?" "Fine," she had said. "I was just seeing Edmund about some property documentation." His expression had shifted, sharpened. "Aldridge," he had said, and it was not a question. She had looked at him. "You know him." "I know he's been working his way up the creek buying properties, and I know that at least one of the challenges to water rights that have been filed in this county in the past year came from a company connected to him." He had said this with the flat precision of someone who had already done the research and was not happy about what he had found. "He's tried to buy out 3 other operations along the creek. 2 of them sold. I've refused him 4 times." She had felt a complicated rush of things. Relief that she was not alone in this. Gratitude again, that specific unsettling kind. And something else, something that had to do with the fact that he was looking at her in the March light on Railroad Avenue with that careful, held expression that she was beginning to find almost unbearable in its restraint. "Well," she had said, "I've refused him 3 times. Something that was almost a smile had crossed his face. 3 times, he had said. "Good." They had ended up in the hotel dining room across the street, which was where all the significant conversations in Rifle seemed to happen, drinking coffee and talking about Gerald Aldridge and water rights and the legal landscape of Colorado Territory for 2 hours. And at the end of it, Calvin had walked her to her wagon and had stood there with his hand on the wagon wheel and said, "Della." It was the first time he had used her given name. She had stopped, 1 foot on the wheel hub, and looked at him, and something in his face had gone very honest and a little unguarded in a way that made her chest hurt. "I want you to know," he had said, "that if Aldridge makes any more visits to your property, I want to know about it. And not because I have any claim on your property or your decisions, but because he had stopped. He had looked away, out toward the mountains. He had looked back at her. "Because you what?" she had said very quietly. "Because I have a stake in what happens to you," he had said. "More than I've known exactly how to say." She had understood this for what it was, and she had understood that it was costing him something to say even this much, and she had said, "I know," very softly, and climbed up into the wagon and driven home, and spent the entire 3 miles back to her homestead with her heart doing things she had no adequate language for. The next 14 months were the most exquisitely uncomfortable and ultimately the most formative of Della Callahan's life. She and Calvin Maddox existed in a state of acknowledged feeling that neither of them had put full words to, moving around each other with the careful awareness of 2 people who know exactly what is in the room with them and are not yet certain how to open the door. He rode past her place more openly now. He stopped, sometimes, to help with a task that was genuinely beyond one person to manage alone, and stayed longer than the task required. She made coffee. They talked about everything, and nothing with the easy fluency of people who find the same subjects interesting, and the same people tiresome. The situation with Gerald Aldridge escalated in May of 1884, when he filed a water rights challenge against 3 of the Divide Creek properties, including Della's. It was a legal mechanism, technically legitimate, and it required a response. She had gone to Edmund Hale, who had said that Calvin Maddox had already filed a counter-challenge on his own M water rights, and that the 2 situations were connected enough that he thought they should coordinate their legal responses. This had been the excuse, if anyone needed one, for Della and Calvin to spend a great deal of time together in the spring and summer of 1884. Going over documents and talking to Edmund Hale and attending 2 hearings in Grand Junction, where a territorial judge had looked at the paperwork and the water rights records and ultimately, in August, ruled against Aldridge's challenge. Aldridge had left the county shortly after the ruling, apparently concluding that Divide Creek was more trouble than it was worth, which Della thought spoke well of the valley's general character. She and Calvin had received the news of the ruling together, standing outside the courthouse in Grand Junction in the late afternoon heat, and she had felt such a specific, contained joy that she had laughed without planning to. And Calvin had looked at her laughing, and something in his face had finally come fully uncovered, and he had reached over and taken her hand. Not in any formal or dramatic way. Just taken her hand, the way you take the hand of someone whose hand you have been wanting to hold for a very long time, with a kind of quiet certainty that said this was not a question. She had held it. They had stood there on the courthouse steps in the August heat, holding hands, and had not said anything for a moment. And then he had said, "Della," and she had said, "Yes." And they had both laughed because the conversation that word "yes" was an answer to was not one that had been fully spoken out loud, but they both understood it perfectly. They had ridden back to Rifle in the stagecoach, which was a 3-hour journey, and Della had sat beside Calvin with her shoulder against his in the cramped interior, and they had talked the entire way home with the easy, slightly giddy fluency of people who have just been given permission to be exactly where they are. And then they had arrived in Rifle, and reality had arrived with them. The reality was that Calvin Maddox had a secret, not a dramatic secret, not a hidden wife or a terrible crime, but a secret of the kind that is almost worse because it is made of real things. His ranch, the Double M, which everyone in the county considered one of the most successful operations in the valley, was carrying a debt load that was significantly more serious than anyone outside his inner circle knew. He had purchased the Double M in 1879 from a man named Harrison Douglas, who had represented the property's finances in terms that had turned out, once Calvin was deep enough in to understand the books properly, to be considerably more optimistic than the reality. He had spent 4 years pulling the operation back towards solvency through relentless work and a series of good cattle seasons. But there were 2 years of notes coming due with the First National Bank of Denver, and the previous cattle season had been harder than expected, and the financial margin he was working with was narrow enough to make a careful man cautious. He had told Hank about it because Hank was his foreman and his friend and needed to know the operational constraints they were working with. He had not told anyone else. He had not told Della. This was not dishonesty in any simple sense. It was the specific kind of withholding that comes from pride and fear combined, from not wanting to ask a woman you are falling in love with to accept complications you are not certain you have solved yet, from the very male and very human instinct to present a situation as whole when it is still being repaired. Della did not know about the debt, but she was smart, and she had been watching him carefully for over a year, and she had noticed things. The way he had hesitated in the autumn of 1883, when Aldridge had made his first offer to the Double M, before declining. The way he managed the ranch with a kind of iron precision about expenditure that went beyond simply good management. The way he had ridden to Grand Junction in June and returned looking as though he had been somewhere unpleasant, which she later understood had been a meeting with the bank. She had not asked him directly, because the asking of direct personal questions about finances was not something a woman in 1884 could do without implications she was not ready to navigate. What she had done in the October of 1884 was say yes when Gerald Aldridge, returned to the county with a revised approach, had come to her again. Not yes to a sale, but yes to an extended conversation about an arrangement that had nothing to do with purchasing her property and everything to do with what she had gradually understood was a different kind of trouble. Aldridge had not come back to buy land. He had come back because he had found something more useful, which was leverage. He had discovered, through means she did not want to examine too closely, something about the Double M's financial situation, and he had come to Della with a proposition that made her feel cold to the center of her bones. If she would agree to support his new water rights claim, which was going to be filed against Calvin's Double M Creek sections, specifically, Aldridge would use his connections in Denver to arrange a refinancing of the Double M's debt through a company he was affiliated with, on terms that would make the payments manageable. If she refused, the water rights challenge would go forward, and the Double M, which depended on its creek water for the summer cattle pasture, would be significantly compromised at exactly the moment when the bank notes were coming due. He had framed it as an opportunity. She had understood it immediately as a trap. She had sent him away and spent 3 days in a state of barely controlled fury, not at Aldridge, who was simply being what he was, but at the situation itself, at the fact that she had been placed in a position where someone else's hidden vulnerability had been used to try to control her choices. She had then sat down at her kitchen table and thought it through with the clear-headed, methodical precision that was her best quality. The first thing she understood was that she needed to tell Calvin, not because she could not handle the situation without him, but because keeping secrets of this particular kind was how these situations grew worse, and because whatever they were to each other now, they were enough that he deserved to know. The second thing she understood was that Calvin needed to hear about the debt situation from her, in the context of her choosing to be honest about what she knew, and not as an accusation or a revelation that humiliated him. The third thing she understood was that this was going to be a difficult conversation, and that the outcome of it would tell her a great deal about what kind of future was or was not available to them. She had gone to the Double M on a Friday morning in October, and she had asked to speak with Calvin privately, and she had told him everything. The visit from Aldridge, the proposition, the implied threat against the creek water rights. And then, carefully, honestly, she had said, "I don't know the details of what he implied about your situation with the bank, Calvin, but whatever it is, you should know that he knows about it, and that he is planning to use it." She would remember what happened in that silence for the rest of her life. It was not a long silence, but it was the kind that is dense with things being rearranged. She watched something cross his face that she had not seen before, a vulnerability, raw and unguarded, the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy alone for a very long time and has just had the weight acknowledged by someone who was not supposed to know it was there. And then, instead of deflecting or minimizing or doing any of the things that men in that particular type of pride and fear combination tend to do, Calvin Maddox had looked at her and told her everything. He had told her about the debt, about Harrison Douglas's misrepresentation of the books, about the 4 years of pulling the ranch back towards solid ground, about the banknotes coming due, about the fact that the past cattle season had been harder than projected, and that he had a plan but it was a tight one, and that he had not told her because he had not known how to say, "I want something real with you, but the real thing I have to offer right now includes some problems I have not finished solving yet." He had said all of this looking at her directly because that was how he did things, and at the end of it she had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "Why did you think I needed you to have it all solved before you could tell me?" He had not answered immediately. "Calvin," she had said, "I homesteaded alone through 2 Colorado winters. I fought a land speculator's water rights challenge. I nursed a cow back from fever with medication I did not know how to administer. I am not a woman who needs problems to be solved before she can engage with them." Something had broken open in him then, not dramatically, not in the way of a man falling apart, but in the way of something held under pressure finally finding the appropriate release point. He had looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said, "No, you are not." They had talked for 4 more hours that day. About the debt, about the plan, about Aldridge's new challenge, and exactly how they were going to address it, which turned out to be simpler than it had seemed because Aldridge's previous water rights loss had left him with significant constraints on what he could file, and Edmund Hale was confident that a well-documented response would hold. They had also talked, finally, about themselves, about the year and more of careful circling and held restraint, and all the things that had been said in the spaces between the things that were said out loud. Calvin had asked her, at the end of that long October afternoon, if she might consider something more permanent between them. He had not said marry me. Not quite, not yet, because he was a man who believed in getting things in the right order, and he felt there was still something owed to both of them in terms of properly arriving at that question. But the implication had been clear, and she had looked at him and felt everything she had been trying to manage for over a year rise up with complete authority, and she had said, "Ask me properly when you're ready to ask." Which was how November, December, January, and February had passed in a state of being very nearly in love without the final words having been formally exchanged, and why Calvin Maddox had sat down on the morning of the 15th of March, 1885, and written a letter, and handed it to Hank Prout, and watched Hank ride down the road toward Della's place, and then stood in the yard of the Double M for approximately 8 minutes before deciding that ink and paper were not sufficient for what he needed to say, and swinging back up onto his black horse. This was why, on that March morning, with the cottonwoods still bare along the creek and the mountain air holding the last cold edge of winter, Della Callahan was standing in her yard with an unread letter in her apron pocket, and Calvin Maddox was 3 feet in front of her, hat in both hands, saying, "I wrote it and then I read it back, and it wasn't enough." "Ask me," she said. He looked at her for a moment that felt like a year compressed into a heartbeat. "Della Callahan," he said, "I have been in love with you since somewhere around the 3rd time you looked at me like you were determining exactly what I was made of, which I believe was the morning I brought firewood in January of 1883, and I have spent the better part of 2 years finding every plausible excuse to be in your vicinity because being anywhere else felt like a waste of time." He paused. "I would like to marry you, if you will have me. Not because the ranch is now entirely solvent, which it nearly is, and not because the Aldrich business is behind us, which it is, but because I cannot imagine the rest of my life without you being in it in the most specific and permanent way available." The meadowlark called again from the pasture. Della pulled the letter from her apron pocket and held it for a moment unread, and then she set it on the porch railing and looked at him. "You rode all the way over here before I could read it," she said. "I did," he said, "because the letter wasn't enough." It was a good letter, he said, with a faint, self-deprecating honesty that she loved deeply and had loved for a long time. "But no, it wasn't enough." "Yes," she said. He went very still. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said again. "That is my answer to the question you asked." He set his hat on the porch railing beside the letter and crossed the 3 feet between them and took her face in both his hands, which were large and warm and slightly rough from the cold, and kissed her with the thoroughness of a man who has been waiting 2 years to do exactly that and is determined to do it properly. She kissed him back with the equivalent thoroughness of a woman who has also been waiting 2 years and has made her peace with wanting this. They were married 6 weeks later, on the first Saturday of May, 1885, in the community hall that smelled of pine resin and fresh flowers, and the specific comfortable mustiness of a building that was used for every important occasion in a community's life. Edmund Hale stood up with Calvin. Mrs. Bauer sat in the front row and wept with transparent satisfaction. Hank Prout, who had been the unwitting instrument of the morning's events, sat in the second row with his hat on his knee, and the particular expression of a man who feels he has played a role in something significant even though he is not entirely certain of the details. The Reverend was a man named Clement Oakes, who had been conducting services in Garfield County since 1877, and who had a beard that arrived in a room slightly before he did, and a speaking voice that could be heard from one end of the valley to the other without apparent effort. He conducted the service with appropriate gravity and slightly more speed than Calvin would have preferred, because there was a reception dinner to get to, and Clement Oakes had been known to prioritize meals with some consistency. Della wore the green dress, the one she had brought from Ohio, because it was the nicest thing she owned and also because she had made her peace with the fact that it was hers now, not a dress associated with grief, but simply her best dress, the one she wore when things mattered. Calvin wore a suit she had not seen before, dark blue wool, obviously purchased for the occasion, and he looked at her when she walked up to the front of the hall with an expression so openly, uncomplicated joyful that she had to look at a point, just past his shoulder for a moment to collect herself. They said their vows. They were the standard vows of the Methodist tradition, which was what the community hall held services for, and they were not elaborate, but there was something in the specific act of saying them out loud, in front of everyone, that made them feel both very light and very weighty at once, the way things do when they are exactly right. Afterwards, at the reception dinner in the hall, Hank Prout came up to Calvin with a glass of apple cider and said, "I notice you rode over yourself before she even read the letter," with the expression of a man who has been waiting to make this observation for 6 weeks. Calvin looked at him. And nothing," Hank said. "It was the right call." He lifted his glass. "To the foreman who knew when to get out of the way." Calvin laughed, which was a sound that Della, standing 3 feet away talking to Mrs. Bauer, heard and turned toward with an automatic smile that she did not try to manage. They moved Della's possessions into the Double M house that same week, which was a much larger house than the homestead cabin, built in 1880 by a previous owner and expanded by Calvin in 1882, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch and a kitchen that faced east and got the morning light. It was not an elegant house. It was a working house, built for the practical business of living in a place that required a great deal of work to live in, and Della moved through it in those first weeks with the specific pleasure of someone discovering all the ways a new space fits the shape of who they are. She kept the homestead. This was something she and Calvin had discussed, and he had agreed immediately without requiring an explanation, because he understood that the land along Divide Creek was Patrick's land, and that it was hers in a way that was not negotiable or transferable. They found a young couple, Tom and Adelaide Harker, recently married and looking to establish themselves, who agreed to work the homestead on a share arrangement, managing the kitchen garden and the small orchard and the hay cutting in exchange for a portion of the proceeds. It worked well. Della rode over once a week, sometimes twice, and found that the arrangement gave her a connection to the land that was uncomplicated by the grinding solitude that had characterized her early years there. The summer of 1885 was the best cattle season the Double M had seen since Calvin had taken ownership. The spring rains were generous, the creek ran full through July, the pastures stayed green later than usual, and the fall sale in Denver returned a price per head that allowed Calvin to pay off the final bank note in October with enough margin left to make the next season's planning considerably less anxious than it had been. He came home from Denver on the evening of the 15th of October and found Della on the porch in the last of the day's light with a book she was not quite reading, and he sat down beside her on the porch bench and said, "It's done." And she had set the book in her lap and looked at him and seen what done meant on his face, and she had taken his hand. "How does it feel?" she had asked. "Like I can breathe in a direction I haven't tried in 4 years," he had said. She had leaned her head against his shoulder. They had sat there until the light was entirely gone, which in Colorado in October is not very long, listening to the sounds the valley makes at the end of a day, the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance the cattle settling for the night. In November, Della told Calvin she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning, because that was when she had known it with certainty, and she was not a woman who believed in delaying things once they were certain. She told him directly, the way she did things, standing at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup, and she watched his face do something extraordinary, the particular expression of a man receiving news that is precisely what he hoped for but did not allow himself to fully anticipate. He had come around the table and put his arms around her, and they had stood in the kitchen in the November morning light with their coffee cooling and the wood stove ticking, and neither of them saying anything, because there was nothing to say that was more adequate than just standing there. Their son was born on the 23rd of July, 1886, on a hot summer evening when the sky to the west was orange and purple with a thunderstorm that circled the valley without quite arriving. The birth was attended by the doctor from Rifle, a capable man named Dr. Ambrose Webb, who had been delivering babies in Garfield County since 1878, and by Mrs. Bauer, who had somehow made herself an indispensable presence at the Double M in the months since the wedding and who managed the occasion with the efficient authority of someone who had witnessed a great many births and found them reliably reassuring. Calvin waited on the porch in the manner of all fathers of that era, which is to say in a state of structured anxiety, and when Dr. Webb appeared in the doorway and said, "A healthy boy, Mr. Maddox, and your wife is fine," Calvin sat down on the porch steps and pressed both hands over his face for a moment, and then stood up and went inside. Della was sitting up in bed in the lamplight, holding the baby, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and the specific radiant exhaustion of a woman who has just done something enormous and knows it. She looked up when Calvin came in and said, "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was small and red-faced and profoundly self-contained, the way newborns are, as though they are still partly somewhere else. The baby had a full head of dark hair and the particular squashed perfection of someone recently arrived in the world. "He looks like you," Della said. "He looks like a baby," Calvin said, but very gently, and he reached out one careful finger and the baby's hand, which was approximately the size of a walnut, closed around it with a grip that was startling in its authority. "What do you want to name him?" Della asked. They had discussed this in the preceding weeks with some inconclusive energy. Calvin had suggestions that were traditional and serious. Della had suggestions that were also traditional but with a slight bias toward her family. They had not fully resolved it. "Patrick," Calvin said. Della looked at him. "After your brother," he said, "if that seems right to you." She looked down at the baby and then back at Calvin and she said, "Yes, that seems exactly right." Patrick James Maddox, named for his uncle and his grandfather on his mother's side, was a substantial and serious baby who grew into a substantial and serious child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's exact precision of expression when she was determining what something was made of. He was, from the beginning, the kind of person who appeared to have arrived with a settled opinion of the world and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Hank Prout, who had been the foreman of the Double M for 6 years by the time Patrick arrived, and who showed no signs of going anywhere, regarded the baby with a kind of awestruck caution that Della found deeply touching. "He looks at you," Hank observed on his first visit to see the infant, "like he's already decided what he thinks of you and is giving you the chance to agree with his assessment." "He does," Della said. "He's going to be trouble," Hank said approvingly. The years arranged themselves with the comfortable velocity of years that are being well used. The Double M grew. Calvin purchased an additional 300 acres to the north in the spring of 1887, which expanded the summer pasture and gave Hank sufficient territory to manage that he required a second hand. A young man named Eli Torres, whose family had been in the Colorado Territory for 2 generations, and who had a gift for understanding cattle that Calvin recognized and valued. Eli Torres was 22 and quiet, and had a habit of showing up exactly where a problem was before anyone had identified it as a problem, which was the most useful quality possible in a ranch hand. He and Hank developed the easy, functional partnership of 2 people who operate from different strengths toward the same end, and the Double M's cattle operation ran with a reliability that freed Calvin to spend more of his time on the larger decisions and on the parts of running a ranch that he genuinely loved, which were the strategic ones, the pasture rotation, the breeding decisions, the market timing. It also freed him to spend time on his porch in the evenings with Della, which was, by his own private accounting, the best use of any time he had available. In March of 1888, Della told him she was pregnant again. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, with her coffee cup in her hands. He reacted the same way he had reacted the first time, which was to come around the table and put his arms around her. And this time, Patrick, who was 20 months old and extremely interested in everything that happened in the kitchen, came over and pressed himself against both their legs with the determined inclusion of a toddler who will not be left out of anything. Calvin picked Patrick up and held him on one arm and Della with the other, and Patrick looked at his father with those serious dark eyes and said very clearly, "What?" "You're going to have a brother or sister," Calvin told him. Patrick considered this information. "When?" he said. "In the fall," Calvin said. Patrick appeared to accept this timeline with the equanimity of someone who has other things to attend to in the interim. He patted Calvin's shoulder once, as though confirming that he had registered the information, and asked to be put down so he could get back to the wooden horse Hank had carved for him that was currently stationed under the kitchen table. The second baby arrived in September of 1888, a girl this time, born on a cool September morning when the aspen on the ridge were just beginning to turn gold. She was smaller than Patrick had been, which had worried Dr. Webb briefly, but she made up for her initial smallness with a volume and a specificity of opinion that suggested she had a great deal to say, and was going to say it as soon as she had the necessary equipment. They named her Rose Margaret Maddox, Margaret for Calvin's mother, who had died when he was 17, and whose quiet strength he had been thinking about more as he became a parent himself. Rose Margaret Maddox proved to have her mother's hair and her father's eyes, and a temperament that was somewhere entirely her own, forceful and curious and entirely unwilling to accept anyone's categorization of what was or was not possible. By the time she was 2, she had identified the kitchen garden as her specific domain, and spent her mornings there with a miniature spade that Eli Torres had made her from a tin spoon, conducting what she clearly considered important agricultural work. The homestead along Divide Creek was flourishing under the Harker family's management. Tom and Adelaide Harker had 3 children of their own by 1888, and the orchard that Patrick Callahan had planted was producing enough apples in a good year to supply the Double M, the Harker family, Mrs. Bauer next door, and enough surplus to sell in town. Della visited every week and felt, each time she stood in the kitchen garden where she had planted her first seeds in that terrible, hard autumn of 1882, both the grief for Patrick and the gratitude for what had grown from his gift of that land, and found that the two feelings had settled into a comfortable coexistence that was perhaps the truest thing she had ever arrived at. One afternoon in the summer of 1889, when Patrick was 3 and Rose was almost 1, and Della was sitting on the Double M porch in the late light with a sleeping baby on her shoulder, Calvin came and sat beside her and said, "I want to show you something." He had been in the barn all afternoon with Eli Torres, which was unusual because the specific project in the barn had been a secret of about 3 weeks that he had been notably unsuccessful at concealing from her, but had been committed to maintaining until he was ready. She had found this endearing, because Calvin was not a man who typically maintained secrets without discomfort. He led her to the barn, which meant carrying the sleeping Rose, who did not wake but made a small protesting sound and settled more firmly against Della's shoulder. In the barn, in the large center stall that had been empty for the past month, was a horse. Not just any horse. A mare, a roan with a white blaze, perhaps 4 years old, with the kind of conformation that suggested intelligence and steadiness and a good deal of useful endurance. She was standing quietly in the stall with the self-possession of an animal that is confident in its own quality. "She's yours," Calvin said. "I thought it was past time." Della had been riding one of the Double M's working horses when she needed to ride, which was practical but not the same as having a horse that was specifically hers. She looked at the mare, who looked back at her with calm, evaluating interest, and she looked at Calvin, who was watching her with the expression he wore when he had done something he was fairly certain was right but was still waiting for confirmation. "She's beautiful," Della said. "I know," he said. "She needs a name." Della considered this for a moment, the sleeping baby on her shoulder and the March evening light coming through the barn's open door, turning everything amber and warm. "Agnes," she said. He looked at her. "After my first cow," she said. "She was the first living thing I saved out here. It seems appropriate." Calvin looked at the mare, who appeared untroubled by the honor, and then back at Della. "Agnes," he said. "All right." She laughed, and the laughing woke Rose, who opened her eyes, looked around the barn with the alert clarity of a baby who falls from sleep to full wakefulness in an instant, saw the horse, and pointed at it with one imperious finger. "Horse," said Rose, who had been saying horse for 2 weeks, it being one of her first and most enthusiastic words. "Yes," said Della, "that's Agnes. She's ours." By the autumn of 1889, life at the Double M had achieved a quality that Della, in her private accounting, thought of as earned happiness, which was different from accidental happiness in the same way that land you have worked is different from land you were simply handed. It had the texture of something real, something that had cost what it cost and was worth every bit of it. She and Calvin had found, in the 4 years of their marriage, that they were suited to each other in the particular way that two self-reliant people can be, which is that their independence reinforced rather than threatened their partnership. She ran the household and the kitchen garden and the orchard production with the same methodical competence she applied to everything. He ran the ranch with the same careful, precise attention he had always brought to it, but without the underlying anxiety that the debt had created, and the difference was visible in him in ways she appreciated every day. They still had their disagreements, because they were both strong-willed and both certain of their own judgment, and neither of them was the kind of person who deferred when they believed they were right. There had been a substantial argument in the spring of 1889 about whether to invest in a mechanical hay baler, which Calvin thought premature and expensive, and Della thought efficient and ultimately economical. They had argued about it for 3 weeks with considerable heat, and then, as the result of a very thorough accounting exercise that Della conducted at the kitchen table one evening, reached the conclusion that she was right, and the baler had been purchased, and it had been exactly as economical as she had predicted, which she had not mentioned more than 4 or 5 times. "You're going to mention the baler again," Calvin had said one evening, watching her cross the hay-cutting numbers off against the baler's purchase cost. "I am not going to mention the baler," she had said. "You are about to mention the baler." "The numbers are speaking for themselves," she had said primly, and he had laughed, and she had laughed too, and Patrick had looked up from the wooden horse he was still devotedly attached to and said, with the authority of a 3-year-old, "Baler," because he had been hearing this word for 6 months. The letter from Mrs. Bower arrived in November of 1889, hand-delivered by Mrs. Bower's eldest granddaughter, who had come to visit from Denver and was now standing on the Double M porch in a city coat, looking like someone who has recently been reminded that the world is larger and more various than Denver. The letter said that Mrs. Bower's health had declined sharply over the summer, which Della had been aware of and worried about, and that she was going to close the sheep operation and go to live with her daughter in Pueblo. She wanted Della to have the first option to purchase the property. Della had taken this to Calvin that evening, and he had read the letter and looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he had asked. "I want to buy it," she said. "It's good land. And it's next to the homestead, which means we could consolidate the creek front eventually, and it would be manageable within our current operation." "Then let's buy it," he had said. She had looked at him, just like that. "You've thought it through," he had said. "You don't bring me things until you've thought them through. What would be the point of my second-guessing the thinking you've already done?" This was one of the things she loved most about him. Not that he always agreed with her, because he did not, but that he respected her thinking as thinking, and engaged with it on those terms. They had purchased the Bower property in December of 1889 at a fair price that reflected Mrs. Bower's preference for selling to someone she trusted over maximizing her return, and the sheep had been absorbed into a small new operation managed by Adelaide Harker's older brother, who had recently arrived from Missouri and needed employment. The property itself was folded into the combined Callahan Maddox Creek holdings, and Della had stood on the ridge above the Bower place on the December morning. They finalized the purchase and looked down at the creek valley below, at the homestead cabin and the barn and the orchard and the Bower land running along beside it, and thought about Patrick, who had come out here with a deed and a dream and not quite enough time, and had managed to leave her something worth building on. In the spring of 1890, Della discovered she was pregnant for the third time. She was 34 years old, Calvin was 38, and Patrick was nearly 4 and Rose was a year and a half, and there was a part of her that was very tired when she thought about the practical aspects of a new baby. There was also a part of her that was very glad, in the straightforward way that people are glad when something good is arriving, and these two feelings coexisted without particular contradiction. She told Calvin in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, because this was apparently her established method for this type of announcement, and he looked at her with the same combination of joy and careful attention to her own response that he had brought to both previous occasions, and said, "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and very happy." He had nodded, as though this combination was entirely appropriate, and come around the table to put his arms around her, and she had leaned into him with the ease of 5 years of marriage and said, into his shoulder, "We are going to need to add a room." "I know," he said. "I was thinking about that this morning." "You knew before I told you. I suspected," he said. "You have been drinking chamomile tea instead of coffee for 2 weeks." She had pulled back and looked at him. "And you didn't say anything." "I was waiting for Tuesday," he said, with a perfectly straight face. The third child, another boy, arrived in October of 1890 in the same sensible manner as the first two, attended by Dr. Webb and Mrs. Webb, who had become the doctor's unofficial deputy in the matter of double M deliveries, and by Hank Prout, who appeared to feel that his presence in the house during these occasions was required by some obligation he had never fully explained, but which everyone had stopped questioning. They named the new boy Henry, for his grandfather on Calvin's side, who had been a blacksmith in Kentucky, and who, by Calvin's account, had been exactly the kind of man you would want to name someone after, solid and skilled and reliably present. Henry Calvin Maddox arrived with the same dark hair as his siblings, and a temperament that was immediately and distinctly warmer than either of them, a baby who smiled early and slept generously, and regarded the world with an openness that was a particular joy to be around. Patrick, who was 4, inspected the new brother with the thoroughness of someone conducting an assessment, and Rose, who was 2, was so delighted by Henry that she required monitoring to prevent her from attempting to carry him, which, given the disparity in their sizes, was a significant practical concern. The double M, in the autumn of 1890, was a different place from the operation Calvin had purchased in 1879, or even from the struggling, debt-weighted ranch of 1882. The 300 additional acres had been fully integrated. The breeding program Calvin had been developing for 5 years had resulted in a cattle line that consistently brought better prices at market. Eli Torres, now 27, had become something between a foreman and a partner, with responsibilities that had expanded well beyond what his original position had included, and Calvin had formalized this in the summer of 1890 with an arrangement that gave Eli a small ownership stake in the operation in exchange for his continued commitment to it. This was not a common arrangement in 1890, but Calvin had thought it through and decided it was the right one, and Della had agreed, and it had produced in Eli a loyalty and a dedication that was its own kind of return. Hank Prout had turned 50 in 1889, and while he was not slowing down in any way that significantly affected his work, he had started to talk occasionally about what came after, which was the kind of conversation that people of a certain age begin to have with the comfortable certainty of someone planning a journey they intend to enjoy. He was talking about a piece of land near Glenwood Springs, a small place with a garden and room for a few horses, and Della had listened to this with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered, and one evening in the fall of 1890 had said to Calvin, "We should do something for Hank, something real. Something that helps him get to Glenwood Springs." Calvin had looked at her for a moment. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. They had done it in a manner that was characteristic of them both, which was to arrange it properly, without fanfare, as a matter of simple right order. Calvin had set aside a portion of the Double M's proceeds from the fall cattle sale, combined with a contribution from Della's homestead accounts, and presented Hank with an amount in December of 1890 that was sufficient, combined with what he had saved himself, to purchase the Glenwood Springs property. Hank had received this with the expression of a man who had not expected it and did not know exactly what to say, and had finally said, "You didn't have to do that," which was also the thing he did not say, which was "thank you," both in words and in the particular way he looked at Calvin and Della for the rest of that evening. He left in the spring of 1891. The Double M farewell was held on the porch on a Saturday afternoon, with a table of food that Della and Adelaide Harker had been cooking since Thursday and Eli Torr's guitar, and everyone connected with the ranch in some capacity gathered in the yard. Hank shook Calvin's hand and held it for a moment, the handshake of two men who do not need to say much because what they mean is evident in the grip. He hugged Della, which was less characteristic for 1891 than it might have been. But Hank Prout had been a witness to too many significant things at the Double M to feel constrained by convention, and she hugged him back with the genuine warmth of someone saying goodbye to a person who had been, without particularly intending to, essential. Patrick, who was 5, watched Hank ride away with the solemn expression of someone recording something important. Rose held her father's hand and waved until the figure was out of sight. Henry, who was 6 months old and in Della's arms, slept through the whole thing with the contentment of someone who would get the story later. The years after 1891 settled into the rhythms of a life being actively lived, full of work and seasons, and the particular richness of a place that has people in it who love each other and know it. Eli Torres took over as foreman with the ease of someone who had been ready for the responsibility longer than the responsibility had arrived, and brought a second hand, his younger cousin Francisco, who was 20 and quick, and had the same instinctive understanding of cattle that ran in the Torres family. Patrick started school in the fall of 1891, in the schoolhouse that had been built on the edge of Rifle in 1885. Taught by a young woman named Miss Clara Hennessy, who had come from Cincinnati and taken the teaching position with the specific determination of someone who intended to make it work. Miss Hennessy found Patrick to be her most challenging student, not because he was difficult but because he was very smart and not always patient with the pace of other students. And she found Rose, when she arrived 2 years later, to be something else entirely. A force of intellectual enthusiasm that required direction rather than encouragement. Henry, when he arrived in school the following year, was the teacher's relief, an eager, warm, genuinely delightful student who loved learning and told his teacher so, which is the kind of student that makes the difficult ones worth it. Della rode Agnes, the roan mare, every morning for as long as Agnes lived, which was until 1898, when the mare died peacefully in her stall at the age of 17. She had a second horse after that, a bay that was also excellent, but Agnes had been the first horse that was entirely hers, and there was a particular place in her memory for the morning she had spent on that horse in the early light of the Colorado Valley, before the household was fully awake, moving through the land that had been her brother's and was now hers, understanding it from horseback in a way you cannot understand any place from the ground. Calvin's dark hair went gray at the temples in the mid-1890s, which Della thought looked well on him and said so. He was, in his mid-40s, a deeply settled man, settled in the good sense of the word, someone who had worked out most of the essential questions, and was getting on with the living that follows. He was still precise, still methodical, still capable of the iron-willed stubbornness that she had initially identified as trouble and later understood as the quality that made him capable of building things that lasted. But the anxiety was gone, the underlying tension of a man carrying too much weight in the wrong direction, and what replaced it was a steadiness that she found, after 10 years of marriage, as restoring as it had seemed in the beginning. They talked every evening. This was one of the constants of their marriage, the kitchen table and the coffee pot, or, in summer, the porch and the evening light, and the conversation that moved through everything, the ranch and the children and the politics and the weather and the books Della was reading, and the things Calvin was thinking about, and sometimes things that neither of them could quite categorize but needed to say anyway. In 1895, a letter arrived from Hank Prout in Glenwood Springs. He had been there 4 years. He was well. He had a garden that was producing more than he could eat, and a pair of horses he described, with the affection he had formerly reserved for the Double M cattle. He had also, the letter revealed with a casualness that could not quite conceal his pleasure, married a widow named Frances, who had 3 grown children and a forthright manner, and who had apparently decided that Hank was worth her attention. He was 60 years old and had not expected this, the letter said, but found himself very glad of it. Della read this letter aloud to Calvin at the kitchen table and then looked up at him when she finished. "Good," she said. "Yes," he said, in the tone that meant he meant it completely. Patrick turned 14 in 1900, which felt to Della like a significant marker, both because 14 was a real age and because it was the turn of the century, which even in a valley in Colorado felt like something worth marking. He was a serious young man with his father's directness and his mother's precision, already demonstrating an interest in the land management aspects of the Double M that suggested where he was going to end up. Rose was 12 and furiously interested in everything, particularly books, and was currently corresponding with a teacher's college in Denver about admission requirements. Henry was 10 and still the sunniest person in the house, which was saying something in a household that was generally not gloomy. Calvin had begun to teach Patrick the more complex aspects of the ranch management that year, not because Calvin was going anywhere, but because the right time to teach someone something is when they are ready to learn it, and Patrick had been ready for a while. The two of them rode the property together on weekend mornings, talking about pasture rotation and water management and cattle breeding decisions, and Della watched them from the porch sometimes, the tall, gray-templed man and the serious, dark-eyed boy, and felt the specific pride and tenderness of watching something important being transmitted from one generation to the next. In 1902, Rose was accepted to the teacher's college in Denver. She left in September, on the same month that Della had arrived in Colorado 20 years earlier, which they all noticed, and which Rose noted with the particular pleasure of a person who appreciates a good symmetry. Della drove her to the stagecoach depot in Rifle, and they sat together for a moment before the stage arrived, and Della said, "Your Uncle Patrick left Ohio for the same reason you're leaving Colorado, to see what he could build somewhere." Rose had looked at her mother with those dark Maddox eyes. "Do you think he'd have liked how it turned out?" she asked. "I know he would," Della said. She watched the stage take her daughter out of the valley, and then she drove home, and Calvin was on the porch when she arrived, because he had known approximately when she would return and had decided to be there when she did, which was the kind of thing he did without being asked and without requiring recognition. "She'll be fine," he said, when Della climbed down from the wagon. "I know," she said. "She'll be more than fine. She'll be extraordinary." He took her hand as she came up the porch steps, and they stood together looking out over the valley that had been the setting of the past 20 years of their lives, the creek and the cottonwoods and the mountains standing clear and permanent in the October light. "Do you remember," she said, "the morning you rode over before Hank had even delivered the letter?" He laughed, the laugh she still loved as much as she had loved the first time she heard it, full-throated and honest. "I remember thinking that I had written everything I needed to say, and then reading it back and knowing it was not enough." "It wasn't," she agreed, "but you came anyway." "I was not going to let paper speak for me," he said, "not for something like that." She leaned against him the way she had been leaning against him for 17 years, with the complete ease of someone who is exactly where they belong. "What did the letter say?" she asked. "I never read it." "I know," he said. "Do you remember what was in it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told you that I had been in love with you for longer than I had known what to do with it," he said. "And that I had been looking for the right way to say it, and had concluded that there was probably no right way, and that the only thing left was to say it wrong and hope you understood." He paused. "And then I wrote it out and decided that delivering that sentiment via a letter handed to Hank was, on reflection, not how it should be done." She laughed. "No," she said, "it was not. So I came myself," he said. "You did," she said, "and you said it right." "I did my best," he said. "You did," she said. "You always do." The mountains across the valley were going pink and gold with the last of the afternoon sun, and somewhere in the barn below them, Patrick was doing the evening feeding with the thorough, methodical care he brought to everything. And inside the house, Henry was helping Eli Torr's wife, Maria, who sometimes came to help with the household when there was extra to do, setting the dinner table and telling her something that she was laughing about. The creek ran where it had always run, full in the spring and lower in the dry late summer, and always there, constant and uncomplicated, doing what water does. Della thought about Gerald Aldridge and his water rights schemes, which had come to nothing, and about Edmund Hale in his office with his steepled fingers, and about the blizzard in January of 1883 and the wagon of firewood, and about Agnes the cow and Agnes the horse, and about Patrick her brother, who had left her this land, and Patrick her son, who was going to carry it forward, and all the mornings and evenings that had made up the middle. She thought about the morning 17 years ago when Hank Prout had ridden up to her door with an envelope and ridden away again, and she had stood in her kitchen not reading it, and then the hooves had come again, faster, and Calvin had ridden in like the land was on fire, because he had decided a letter was not enough. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I was always going to come," he said. "It just took me a while to stop trying to say it some other way first." She turned her head and kissed him on the jaw, which was still rough with the end of the day, and he turned and kissed her properly, and they stood on the porch of the house they had built together in the evening light of an October in Colorado at the beginning of a new century, and everything was, in the most complete and particular sense of the word, well. Patrick came up from the barn and found them on the porch, and with the 16-year-old's combination of warmth and the determination to find his parents' affection for each other marginally embarrassing, he said, "Supper's going to be ready," and went inside, and they heard him call something to Henry, and Henry laughing, and the sounds of the house in the evening, which were the best sounds there were. They went inside. The table was set. The lamp was lit. Outside, the October dark was coming down over the valley, soft and complete, and the creek ran on in the darkness, and the mountains stood in it, permanent and certain, and the double M lay quiet under the stars of Colorado, which were more stars than most people ever see, so many that they seemed less like a sky and more like a proof of something. Della set the soup on the table and sat in her place, and Calvin sat in his, and Patrick and Henry filled in the spaces between them, and they said grace, which was a Maddox family tradition that had been Calvin's mother's before it was his. And then they ate and talked, and laughed at something Henry said about Francisco Torres' attempt to teach a calf to respond to its name, and argued briefly and cheerfully about whether Rose would come home for Christmas, and decided she would, and talked about what they would do to mark the occasion, and ate the apple tart that Maria had made from the orchard apples, which were still the best apples in the valley, as Patrick Callahan had apparently known they would be. When supper was done and the boys had gone up to their rooms and the kitchen was cleaned and the lamp was turned low, Calvin and Della sat at the kitchen table for a while longer with their coffee, the way they had sat at that table for 17 years, talking about whatever was on their minds and comfortable in the silences between. "She's going to be a wonderful teacher," Della said. "Rose." "She is," Calvin said. "Like her mother." "I'm not a teacher," Della said. "You have been teaching things to people for 20 years, Calvin said. "You just don't call it that." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man with gray at his temples and 20 years of mornings in his face, and felt the particular warmth that comes not from the early days of love but from its later, deeper country, where everything is known and wanted anyway. "You're very good at saying the right thing these days," she said, "given how long it took you initially." 20 years of practice," he said. "You sent your foreman," she said, smiling. "And then I came myself," he said. "You always came yourself," she said. "That was the thing." He reached across the table and took her hand, and the lamp burned low, and outside the Colorado night was full of stars, and somewhere in the house the boys were sleeping, and it was all, entirely and without reservation, enough. More than enough. It was everything.